Let's begin with the title. Actually, I've been calling it Song of Solomon, but if we were going to go with the Hebrew title itself, it's actually the Song of Songs. In Hebrew, it's Shir HaShirim, and that gets translated into the Septuagint as Esma Asmaton, and then the rest of the title tells us that it is Solomon's song. So Shir Hashrim Asher Li Shlomo. Now, of course, the traditional understanding is that Solomon is the author of this text, but just be, just because we have the preposition next to a name doesn't mean it's always the author. It could just mean it is um, composed in tribute to Solomon. In fact, one of the things we'll be doing is talking about who exactly wrote this song. With every book, we want to talk about issues of authorship and dating, especially at the beginning. And that helps us to put these books into context, like when were they composed and why. Um, with as with most other books in the wisdom literature, the traditional author is believed to be Solomon. So that was the case with Proverbs as well as Ecclesiastes. And in both the Jewish and Christian traditions, that has been understood. However, there's one interesting counter tradition. I think I alluded to this um, in reference to some of the other books of the Bible. So in the Babylonian Talmud, particularly in Baba Bathra 14b, which is cited in Bergsma and Petrie, there's a tradition that Hezekiah wrote this book. So here it says, who wrote the scriptures? Hezekiah and his colleagues wrote Isaiah, Proverbs, the Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Perhaps Solomon composed an early version of this text, which was expanded upon and then reached its final canonical form during the time of Hezekiah. We know that Hezekiah did, in fact, redact some books of the Bible. Remember in our episode on Proverbs, we saw how in Proverbs 25 it talks about Hezekiah adding extra material to the book. Now, there is evidence within the book itself to suggest that this is an early work. One interesting bit of evidence comes from chapter 6, verse 4, where the beloved is compared to Tirzah. Now, for those who are familiar with your Old Testament history, Tirzah was designated as the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel after the split between the two kingdoms. This occurs in the book of First Kings. Let me pull it up. So if you read First Kings chapters 14 and onwards, it talks about how when the division between the two kingdoms occurred, King Jeroboam turned Tirzah into the capital city of the north. So the fact that Tirzah and Jerusalem are mentioned together here seems to point to a time before the split occurred, because assuming that this was composed in the royal court, they would not refer to Tirzah as in such a positive way after the split. After all, uh, why would you praise the capital city of a rival kingdom? Which leads us to believe that at least part of the book was composed during Solomon's time itself, if not the whole book. Now, on the other hand, it has been suggested that some of the language of the book suggests a late dating. Some features of the book appear to be characteristic of later stages of the Hebrew language. A lot of it is actually similar to what we said earlier about Ecclesiastes. So I refer the listener to our previous episode in Ecclesiastes, where we talked about the kind of Hebrew that is used in Song of Songs, particularly the use of the shortened particle, she. We have an example actually here, where it says, Shehem Hirhivuni. So those who know Hebrew know that the particle she is a shortened form of asher, which designates the relative pronoun who, what, or which. Um, Now, Gleason Archer, in his Old Testament survey, which I have over here, in both his section on Ecclesiastes and his section on Song of Solomon, talks about the fact that this is not necessarily evidence of late dating so much as it is evidence of a dialectical difference. Some of the features that we associate with late biblical Hebrew may have been present in earlier time periods um, as part of the dialect of certain parts of Palestine. So perhaps in northern Israel, this was how they spoke. And some of the literary features that we associate with early quote unquote Hebrew may have been more characteristic of the literary courts of the southern part of Israel. So, in other words, Song of Solomon is written in a more colloquial style rather than the more antique or archaic form of other books. It's also been suggested that because of certain Persian and Greek loanwords in the book, um, you have a late date. So there are two words in Song of Songs that appear to be loanwords from Greek and Persian. The first one is the word apirion here. So King Solomon made himself a carriage. Apirion asa lo hamelech Shlomo. So apirion is actually a Greek word from for carriage or sedan chair, as the footnote says here, which would indicate that this particular verse was composed at a time when Greek was already starting to become a more commonly known language. Another example of a loan word is in Song of Songs 4:13, where it says, "Your shoots are an orchard of pomegranates with all choicest fruits and a nard." Shlachicha pardes rimonim. So pardes comes from Persian. It's the word for garden or enclosure. Now, it has been suggested though that the word pardes, even though it is in Persian, may have also been used in some older languages such as Assyrian, and so King Solomon may not necessarily have gotten this from Persian. The one in 413, which is from Greek, seems to be a more likely candidate for a late inclusion. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that a late date is known for sure. There are other theories as to how a Greek and a Persian word or an Assyrian word could have made their way into the Hebrew of the text. Perhaps King Solomon, being very cosmopolitan, had contacts as far as Mycenae. So that could be one way that a Greek word has made its way into a 10th century Hebrew text. So we shouldn't put too much stock into foreign loanwords as a way of dating books. I know that's a common technique used by a lot of historical critical scholars, but I think the evidence, too much gets read into this evidence. But you already know that if you've watched some of my past episodes where I point out Aramaic or Persian or other loanwords in the text. It's also familiar to anyone who has read Gleason Archer's book on the topic. Anyone who wants a summary of the arguments for and against various historical critical theories really ought to have this book in their library. Now, moving on, we can talk about the identity of the characters in the story. There's been a lot of talk about who exactly these people are, the lover and the beloved. So we'll start with the lover. He is often thought of as being Solomon, and this is based on the fact that not only is Solomon the traditional composer of the book, but he appears a couple of times in the text itself. So The first place where he appears is in chapter 3, verses 6 to 11. What is that coming up from the wilderness, like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the fragrant powders of a merchant? Behold, it is the litter of Solomon. Around it are 60 mighty men, some of the mighty men of Israel, all of them wearing swords and expert in war, each with his sword at his thigh against terror by night. King Solomon made himself a carriage from the wood of Lebanon. He made its posts of silver, its back of gold, its seat of purple. Its interior was inlaid with love by the daughters of Jerusalem. Go out, O daughters of Zion, and look upon King Solomon, with the crown with which his mother crowned him on the day of his wedding, on the day of the gladness of his heart. He's mentioned again in chapter 8, starting in verse 11 and going up to verse 12. It says here, Solomon had a vineyard at Baal Hamon. He let out the vineyard keepers. Each one was to bring for its fruit 1,000 pieces of silver. My vineyard, my very own, is before me. You, O Solomon, may have the 1,000, and the keepers of the fruit 200. So here's the other reference to Solomon in the text. Besides this, there is another reference that appears to be about Solomon, and it's about the multiple spouses of the lover. In chapter 6, verses 8 to 10, it says, There are 60 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. My dove, my perfect one, is the only one of her mother, pure to her who bore her. The young women saw her and called her blessed, the kings and concubines also, and they praised her. Who is this who looks down like the dawn, beautiful as the moon, bright as the night, awesome as an army with banners? In other words, whoever the lover is here, he has a lot of women in his life. And who do we know in the Bible had a lot of women in his life? Solomon. In First Kings, it is said that he had 700 wives and concubines. And if there are only 60 here, and 60 queens and 80 concubines, that would indicate that this was still a relatively early time in Solomon's life before he acquired the other 500-ish women in his life. That being said, not everyone believes that the lover in question is Solomon. There are certain parts of the book which seem to describe the lover in ways that are uncharacteristic of the king. He is described, for example, as a man of the fields, like a shepherd boy, which leads to a theory that has arisen among certain commentators in recent times, which is that the lover in the Song of Solomon is not Solomon himself, but a rival to Solomon, a certain unnamed shepherd boy with whom Solomon is competing for the boy's affections. The understanding is, as the theory goes, that Solomon wants this woman to become part of his harem, but the woman in question prefers this other boy who is not quite as rich as Solomon, but has other things going for him. Now, that's an interesting theory, and it certainly makes sense of some parts of the text, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. There are other explanations for the text that could account for why Solomon, why the boy seems to be, or the lover seems to be described differently from Solomon at certain points. It's been suggested, for example, by some commentators that perhaps the lover represents a more youthful version of Solomon before he became what he is at the time of writing. So Solomon is, in a sense, projecting a younger version of himself onto the song and perhaps fictionalized some of his own features to fit the theme of the song. So we need not deviate from the older understanding that the lover in question is Solomon. Now let's talk about who the lover is. There are a couple of texts in the book that give us a hint as to who she is. The first one is in chapter 1, verses 5 to 7, where the beloved describes herself. I am very dark but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. Tell me, you whom my soul loves, where you pasture your flock, where you make it lie down at noon. For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? Um, the woman here is described as having dark skin, and some commentators have suggested that because of this, the woman in question must have been an Egyptian or even an Ethiopian. I've even heard it theorized that the beloved has come from as far away as India, which is, of course, knowing the cosmopolitan nature of Israel at this time, it's not impossible for someone from India to have been part of Solomon's harem. But this need not be the case, because once again, there are a couple of hints in the text that point to a different direction. First of all, notice that the beloved is talking to the daughters of Jerusalem. So this would mean that the woman in question is not from another country, but is actually a native Israelite. Also, there's a reference to the sun looking upon the woman. So the fact that she has dark skin doesn't mean that she was born that way. It could mean that she is under the sun all the time and as a result got a really nice tan. Um, if we go by this, we need not rule out that a Hebrew woman is in question. This is strengthened by the other reference that we're going to look at, which is in chapter 6. In verse 13, it says, Return, return, O Shulamite, return, return, that we may look upon you. Why should you look upon the Shulamite as upon a dance before the two armies? So Shulamite is a very interesting word, and there are two theories about what that means. One is that it means a woman from a town known as Shulam. So Shulam would have been a town somewhere in Israel. If so, we don't actually know where Shulam is, so this is a little bit speculative. Another possibility is that Shulamite here is basically a feminization of Shlomo or Solomon. So if you look at the name in Hebrew, Shulamit, it sounds like Shlomo, but in a feminized form, which is not uncommon throughout Hebrew, where a male form of a certain male name has a Hebrew equivalent. Think of Judah or Yehuda, for example. Its feminine counterpart would have been Judith or Yehudit. So it's not impossible that Shulamit is a feminine version of Shlomo, in which case we have a very interesting situation where the beloved in question is basically described as a female Solomon, which, if the author of the book is Solomon himself, has some interesting implications. Um, Perhaps because of how similar the beloved and the lover are to each other. I guess, um, the beloved is sort of mirroring her lover in terms of appearance and personality. There is a lot to unpack in here. But we should try not to speculate too much, because a lot of what we could possibly say about this book involves trying to read between the lines, and people read between the lines in different ways. So that being said, we can then talk about how exactly to understand this book. Song of Solomon has spawned a lot of interpretations throughout its history. because it's so hard to understand, in Rabbinic Judaism, it said that um, the rabbis forbade Jewish men to read the book before the age of 30, because the idea was before you were 30 years old, you don't have the wisdom or the maturity to properly interpret the book. Now, you know, maybe it is a little bit difficult to understand a book, but we need not believe that young people can't properly understand it, especially with the benefit of tradition and um, the various commentaries that have been composed on the books on this book over the past few centuries. If you look at Petrie and Bergsma, they actually identify five different ways that this book has been interpreted. And then on top of that, there's actually one additional interpretation that they don't mention, which is the pursuit of wisdom interpretation. I'll talk about that after I go through the ones that they do mention. So let's see, where's the section on interpreting the book? Sorry, this is the section on the wisdom of Solomon. Why am I here? There we go. So 5 approaches to the book. So as I mentioned, there will be 6 approaches, but Petrie and Bergsma only mention 5. So we'll look at the 5 that they mention. The first is the erotic love interpretation. This is the interpretation that takes the book at face value as a description of love between a man and a woman. Now, one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have is that the literal interpretation of this book was completely unknown in ancient times. But this is not the case. At least one early church father actually did interpret the book literally, and that was Theodore of Mopsuestia. So somebody in the early church did actually think about taking the Song of Songs as a face value understanding of love between a man and a woman. This is what Theodore of Mopsuestia states on the book. Solomon took Pharaoh's daughter as his wife. Note that he identifies the Shulamite as an Egyptian. But she was dark, as all the Egyptian and Ethiopian women are. The Hebrews and their beautiful wives, and the other princesses as well, ridiculed her on account of her unseemliness, her small height, and her dark complexion. To avoid any irritation on her part, and so that no hostility would result between him and the Pharaoh, Solomon exclusively built for her a house of valuable stones and decorated with gold and silver. During the meals, he chanted the Song of Solomon in her presence in order to honor her, and he made it known with it that she was dark yet beautiful and loved by him. Now, if you think about it, there's a face value um, plausibility to this, because if you go to First Kings, we know that a significant portion of Solomon's story is dedicated to how he received a bride from Pharaoh. Let me see, what chapter was that in? Pharaoh gives his daughter to Solomon as a bride in First Kings chapter 3. So let's go there. In First Kings chapter 3, verse 1, it says, Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord in the wall around Jerusalem. So basically what Theodore of Mopsuestia has done is he has cross-referenced Song of Solomon with this passage. And she is mentioned again in a few other places in First Kings. We need not read those. Now, Theodore of Mopsuestia had some controversial opinions. I think he was a universalist. Someone who has better knowledge of patristics, correct me on that. But he was anathematized along with several of his opinions in the Second Council of Constantinople around the 6th century. So from that time onward, the literal interpretation of the book has fallen by the wayside. It was recovered in recent years For example, if you read Pope John Paul II's Theology of the Body, Song of Songs features prominently in it, and he assumes a literal interpretation of the book. So I'll read a few sections from Theology of the Body to see how Pope John Paul II uses the book in his theology. So first, here we have a comment of from the beginning part of the book, which the Pope comments on, and he says the following. Already, the first verses of the song lead us immediately into the atmosphere of the whole poem, in which the bridegroom and the bride seem to move in the circle traced by the irradiation of love. The words, movements, and gestures of the spouses correspond to the inner movement of their hearts. It is only through the prism of such a movement that one can understand the language of the body in which that discovery occurs, which the first man expressed in front of her who had been created as a help similar to himself, and who had been drawn, as the biblical text reports, from one of his ribs. So this discovery, already analyzed on the basis of Genesis 2, clothed itself in the Song of Songs with all the richness of the language of human love. What was barely expressed in the second chapter of Genesis, in just a few simple and essential words, is developed here in a full dialogue, or rather in a duet, in which the bridegroom's words are interwoven with the bride's, and they complete each other. On seeing the woman created by God, man's first words express wonder and admiration, or better more, the sense of fascination. And a similar fascination, which is wonder and admiration, runs in fuller form through the verses of the Song of Songs. It runs in a peaceful and even wave from the beginning to the end of the poem. So Pope John Paul II actually connects Song of Songs with Genesis 2, seeing the bridegroom and bride in the book as counterparts to Adam and Eve. And from this, he sees Song of Songs as a celebration of the wonders of marital love. Later on, he talks in the following words, commenting off chapter 4, verse 7. You are all beautiful, my friend, and there is no spot in you. The bridegroom ends his song with this word, leaving all metaphors behind in order to turn himself to the only one through whom the language of the body seems to express what is most proper to femininity and the whole of the person. And of course, he continues to analyze Song of Songs in subsequent sections of Theology of the Body. I highly recommend readers get a copy of Theology of the Body if they want to see what Pope John Paul II has to say on the book. Some commentators, in attempting to retrieve the literal interpretation, have gone too far in denying that the song means anything else. So one Catholic exegete, Emil Osti, cited in Petrine Bergsma, says the following. The song celebrates love, human love, and only human love. The tons of comments poured over this booklet did not succeed in hiding the truth, which is so clear to the eyes of the unprepared reader. In its literal first and direct meaning, the song deals with human love, uniting man and woman in marriage. Now, a lot of other interpreters have taken the same track. So if you look among Protestant commentators, such as Bruce Waltke and Tremper Longman, they also take the same stance that the Song of Songs is exclusively a tract about human love, that to read anything else into it is a form of eisegesis. As we will see shortly, I disagree with this. There are, even apart from sacred tradition, which teaches us that there are multiple senses to the text, there are internal cues within Song of Songs itself that point to an interpretation beyond merely human love. But at the bare minimum, we have to say that human love is one of the primary intended meanings of the book. So the second interpretation that Petrine Bergsma note is the divine love interpretation. So this is the one that has predominated most history, and it is also one of the earliest interpretations of the book. So Josephus, for example, regards the Song of Songs as hymn to God. Rabbi Akiva, writing in the 2nd century AD, condemns anyone who treats the Song of Songs as a literal text on human love. He even says the following: He who sings the songs of songs in the banquet hall and makes it into a kind of ditty has no place in the world to come. And of course, this enters the Christian tradition through Origen of Alexandria, who was one of the great promoters of allegorical interpretation in the Christian tradition. Thanks to him, allegorical readings predominate our exegesis of the Old Testament throughout most of the patristic and medieval periods, with the few rare exceptions, such as Theodore of Mopsuestia. So, according to this interpretation, the lover is God, and the beloved is either Israel in the Old Testament or the church in the New Testament. So, it depends on whether you are looking at the text from an Old Testament or a New Testament lens. But the basic idea is that the Song of Songs describes God wooing his people. Now, there is a subcategory within this, which is the Messianic interpretation, which is that the bridegroom is actually the Messiah. And we can see this in some of the Targumim, which are the ancient Jewish translations of the Hebrew Bible into Aramaic. And once again, just like with the previous interpretation, the Christian tradition has seen it similarly. St. Augustine is cited in Petrine Bergsma as a promoter of the Messianic interpretation. He reads it as follows in The City of God. So there's a section on the City of God which talks about this book, where it says this: But now the Song of Songs is a certain spiritual pleasure of the holy minds in the marriage of that king and queen city, that is Christ and the church. But this pleasure is wrapped up in allegorical veils, that the bridegroom may be more ardently desired and more joyfully unveiled. There is one hint in the book that seems to point towards a messianic interpretation, and that comes at the very end of the book. So if you go to the Song of Songs, chapter 8, go to the last two verses, 13 and 14, there is this idea of the beloved being still out there, and the beloved is still out there, and she is waiting for him. O you who dwell in the gardens with companions listening for your voice, let me hear it. Make haste, my beloved, and be like a gazelle or a young stag on the mounds of spices. So the book ends on a note of unfulfilled longing, where the woman is still waiting for her man. And a number of commentators suggested that this points to the people of Israel waiting for their Messiah to come. And of course, if we read it with a New Testament lens, we could also see this as the church waiting for the second coming of Christ. Now, the fourth interpretation is called the mystical interpretation, which is a variation of the second interpretation that we mentioned, but it's much more individualized. Instead of the people of Israel or the church collectively, it is the individual believer and his or her relationship to God. And Saint Therese of Lisieux actually understood Song of Songs in this way, as we see in the following quote: If I had time, I would like to comment on the Song of Songs. I have discovered in this book such profound things about the union of the soul with her beloved. And then John Paul II, in one of his addresses, understands it similarly. So, alongside the interpretation that the woman is the church, she can also be understood as the individual Christian, which makes sense if you think about it. A lot of texts in the Bible that refer to the church collectively can also be understood as being directed towards Christians individually. And then the fifth interpretation that Petrine Bergsma mentioned is the liturgical interpretation, which is This one requires a bit of cross referencing with other texts. So, one thing that Petrie and Bergsma have pointed out is that if you look at certain passages in the book, they seem to point to other places in the Old Testament that describe the temple, and this would point to Song of Songs being an allegory for liturgical worship. Um, and we'll look at that in more detail when we talk about the Wasif understanding of Song of Songs. Wasif being a description of the beloved in certain chapters of the book. So there's one interpretation besides the five I mentioned that are not brought up by Petrie and Bergsma, and I learned this one from listening to the Bible Project podcast, as well as James Jordan and Peter Lightheart in their Theopolis podcast. They have a very long series on Song of Songs, which I found very instructive. So they take what can be best described as the pursuit of wisdom interpretation. So according to their understanding, um, the the woman in Song of Songs is actually Lady Wisdom, and Solomon here is presented as basically himself, but also standing in for anyone who is a seeker of wisdom. And this kind of makes sense if you refer back to Proverbs, which we looked at 2 episodes ago. Wisdom is personified as a woman who is calling out to her lover. Uh, so, in, so let's go back to Proverbs, shall we? Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest places in the town. Whoever is simple, let him turn and hear. To him who lacks sense, she says, come eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live and walk in the way of insight. So, wisdom, in a sense, is wooing the listener to spend time with her and to become wise with her. And it is painted in what can best be described as romantic terms. And in a sense, this informs Song of Songs. And this would make a lot of sense if we believe that both books were written by the same person. So, just as wisdom is pursued in Proverbs, um, the beloved is pursued by her lover in Song of Songs. So, Song of Songs can be understood as the pleasure, in terms of the pleasure that is acquired when one acquires wisdom. All of these senses that I mentioned are valid. So, one of the things that we believe as Catholics is that Scripture can have multiple senses. Um, the Catechism talks about the fourfold interpretation of Scripture, and as we see, several of these interpretations map onto one of those senses. So we can take all these are valid. We need not exclude any one of them. And I think any attempts to pit them against one another, as if the human love interpretation was somehow against the divine love interpretation or vice versa, is a wrong-headed approach. All of these can peacefully coexist. And if God is as infinitely wise as we make him out to be, then he could certainly create a text that has all these shades of meaning. Now, moving on, we can talk about how to understand certain elements of the book. So, one of the interesting things about the Song of Songs is how it simultaneously points to a consummation of marital love and of a longing for a marital love that isn't there yet. You can see this in Song of Songs chapter 3. So remember, we just read verses 6 to 11, which seems to point to a wedding that is just about to be consummated. And yet, elsewhere in the book, we seem to have a woman who is looking for her lover but hasn't found her yet. So Um, for example, just before the passage we read in verses 1 to 5, it says this: On my bed by night I sought him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. I will rise now and go about the city, in the streets and in the squares. I will seek him whom my soul loves. I sought him, but found him not. The watchmen found me as they went about in the city. Have you seen him whom my soul loves? Scarcely had I passed them when I found him whom my soul loves. I held him and would not let him go until I had brought him into my mother's house, into the chamber of her who conceived me. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, that you do not stir up or waken love until it pleases. Later on, when you get to chapter 5, and then again in chapter 8, you have the lover looking for her beloved, which is odd if all this was happening in real time. Didn't you just spend time with him? There is one interpretation that has arisen among recent commentators, that the sections describing marital love are a sort of dream sequence where the woman is asleep and she is dreaming of her wedding night. Um, but in reality, the woman has not been wedded yet. She is still looking forward to it. In fact, um, the certain passages in the book seem to suggest that the woman in question is still a young girl who has yet to experience marital love and is still a virgin. There are two passages that point towards this. So, chapter 4, verses 12 to 15 says the following: A garden locked is my sister, my bride, a spring locked, a fountain sealed. Your shoots are an orchard of pomegranates with all choicest fruits, henna with nard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with all trees of frankincense, myrrh and aloes, with all choice spices. A garden fountain, a well of living water, and flowing streams from Lebanon. Awake, O north wind, and come, O south wind. Blow upon my garden, let its spices flow. So the locked garden vision or description seems to suggest that the woman in question is a virgin. She's never known a man before, which makes the previous chapter a little odd because it's describing a wedding night. Does not a wedding night involve consummation? Later on in chapter 8, verses 8 to 10, we have the following. Description. We have a little sister, but she has no breasts. What shall we do for our sister on the day when she is spoken for? If she is a wall, we will build on her a battlement of silver. But if she is a door, we will enclose her with boards of cedar. I was a wall, and my breasts were like towers. Then I was in his eyes as one who finds peace. So the woman in question is describing herself uh, as a virgin who is still too young to actually have known a man. And if you juxtapose this with the descriptions of a man and woman consummating their love, we can understand these passages as descriptions of the woman as she is as present, and then in her waking moments. And then the marital love sequences within the book are actually descriptions of her dreams, where she is looking forward to her future wedding. Which, of course, puts a lot of texts in Song of Solomon in perspective, because some people have thought that the book is a little risque. Sometimes some critics have even described it as pornographic. But if you read it closely, those descriptions are not actual descriptions of consummated love, but rather dream sequences, visions that the woman is having that have not yet become reality at that point in time. Also, it should be noted that while consummation is suggested in the text, there are no explicit sexual descriptions in the book. There's a lot of filling in the blanks, so to speak, when you're reading the book. Like, what does it mean for the woman to taste her man? That is left up to the imagination. One of the famous elements of Song of Songs is the way that the man and woman describe each other. So let's go back to chapter 4. So this is one of the most famous passages in the book, and has, and if you go on Google, people have even attempted to illustrate this. Behold, you are beautiful, my love. Behold, you're beautiful. Your eyes are doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats leaping down the slopes of Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of shorn ewes that have come up from the washing, all of which bear twins, and not one among them has lost its young. Your lips are like a scarlet thread, and your mouth is lovely. Your cheeks are like halves of pomegranate behind your veil. Your neck is like the Tower of David built in rows of stone. On it hang 1,000 shields, all of them shields of warriors. Your two breasts are like two fawns, twins of a gazelle, that graze among the lilies. Until the day breathes and the shadows flee, I'll go away to the mountain of myrrh and the hill of frankincense. So it's very illustrative, and some people have wondered what to make of this. Some commentators, such as Richard Hess in his Old Testament introduction, have suggested that this is what you call a wasf, which is an ancient Syrian wedding song that is used in various ancient Near Eastern cultures, and in Arabic cultures it's still used to this day, where the descriptions of the bride and groom are glorified in song. Now, not everyone agrees with this interpretation. Gleason Archer, in his Old Testament survey, disagrees with it. He suggests that this is an anachronism because we have no examples of such a genre during the time period of Solomon. Now, it could be the case that such descriptions did exist at the time, but just weren't recorded down. Actually, there is one ancient Near Eastern text. I almost forgot to include this, but we have one parallel to this passage in Pritchard, and that is the wedding song that appears. Let me see if I can find it. There is a particular song in the book. Actually, let me pull up my physical copy of Pritchard. I remember reading this a short while ago. Okay, so it's 403 for those who have a physical copy of Pritchard. There is a love poem. There's a section on love poetry in the book here. So let me see if I can find it. It is in chapter 17. So let me find chapter 17 here. Egyptian love songs. So hold up. There is actually, let me find the actual, it's called, so there are a number of Egyptian love songs. I'm still looking for it in here, but I have it in pages 403 onwards of Pritchard's ancient Near Eastern texts. And here, actually, a lot of the language of Song of Songs is similar to this. So, for example, one of the stanzas says the following: "Would that thou wouldst come to the sister speedily, like a horse of the king, picked from 1,000 of all steeds, the foremost of all the stables. It is distinguished in its food, and its master knows its paces. If it hears the sound of the whip, it knows no delay, and there is no foremost of the chasseurs who can stay before it. How well the sister's heart knows that he is not far from the sister." So, and then another part says the following: "My body has become heavy, forgetful of my own self. If the chief of physicians come to me, my heart is not content with their remedies. The lector priests, no way out is in them. My sickness will not be probed. To say to me, 'Here she is what will revive me. Her name is what will lift me up. The going in and out of her messengers is what will revive my heart. More beneficial to me is the sister than any remedies. She is more to me than the collected writings. My health is her coming in from outside. When I see her, then I am well. If she opens her eye, my body is young again. If she speaks, then I am strong again. When I embrace her, she drives evil away from me. But she has gone forth from me for 7 days. So notice how the Egyptian love song uses a lot of similar language, which suggests that this kind of description was known even during that time in other cultures. Also, notice that just like in Song of Songs, the bride is described as a sister here. So you can see that some of these motifs are not unique to Hebrew poetry or Hebrew wisdom. At least the Egyptians had something similar to it. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to touch on in the remaining time that we have. So, first is the fact that a lot of the descriptions that we just read actually parallel other texts in the Old Testament. So, these wasps actually point to the liturgical interpretation that we were just describing. So, in Bergsma and Petrie, uh, they actually have a table. Let me see if I can find a table. Da-da-da-da. Song of Songs as allegory for Yahweh's love for Israel. So here, Preacher and Bergsma have done us all a service by putting descriptions of the bride and groom next to other passages which describe the temple in Jerusalem as well as Yahweh. So in Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 5, it says, I'm very dark but comely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon, which is parallel to 2 Chronicles 3:14, where it says, and Solomon made the curtain in the temple of blue and purple and crimson fabrics and fine linen. In chapter 4:11, it says, the scent of your garments is like the scent of Lebanon, which parallels 1 Kings 7:2. Solomon built the house of the forest of Lebanon upon 3 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams. And then you have a couple of other descriptions. I won't read it, but you can see it on the screen here, showing that the bride is in some ways meant to represent the temple. But if the bride is the temple, that makes the bridegroom Yahweh. And here we have a table where Petrie and Bergsma connect descriptions of the bridegroom with descriptions of Yahweh in the rest of the Hebrew Bible. In many places, the bridegroom is described as him whom my soul loves, which parallels Deuteronomy 6, where it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Chapter 1, verse 4, it says, the king has brought me into his chambers. We will exult and rejoice in you, which parallels Psalm 118:24. This is the day which the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And there are many other such descriptions throughout the Old Testament, which point to the fact that the aforementioned allegorical interpretation, it's not just imposed upon the text. We have internal cues within the book itself that show that it is, in fact, meant to be read this way. But I think the best way to make that connection is to look beyond the Old Testament into the New. There are a number of passages in the Old Testament, in the New Testament rather, that appear to be parallels to Song of Songs. So one interesting example is in the resurrection narrative in John 20. And this is actually a connection that is made by one of the early church fathers. Let me see, which church father was it again? There is, I believe it was St. John Chrysostom, if memory serves. Right, this is the Wisdom of Solomon. Why do I keep going to the Wisdom of Solomon? So it's actually my bad. It's actually Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, and what he does is very interesting. He takes John 20 verses 11 to 18. I won't read the whole text, but you have Mary Magdalene at the tomb looking for her Lord. And according to Saint Cyril, the language of this particular story closely mirrors the language of the bride looking for the bridegroom in Song of Songs. If that is the case, then we have a direct connection between Song of Songs and the Gospels, which lends credence to the messianic interpretation. But of course, the best this connection that we can make is not from the Gospels, but from the book of Revelation. So if you want bridegroom language, it doesn't get much better than Revelation 19, which describes the marriage supper of the Lamb. So keep all of the descriptions in mind, which we just read, and I want you to juxtapose that in your mind with the description of the second coming in Revelation 19, verses 6 to 9, all right, which we'll read here. Then I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters, and like the sound of many peals of thunder, crying out, Hallelujah! For the Lord our God, the Almighty, reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. And the angel said to me, Write this, Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, These are the true words of God. So in the book of Revelation, Jesus is the bridegroom and the church is the bride. Assuming that St. John is well familiar with the language of Song of Songs, it is quite plausibly to be thought, deliberately using the language of the song in describing the second coming. If we read the Song of Songs in that light, and we put on the New Testament lens, then we can understand Song of Songs as Christ wooing the church. It's not just an externally imposed interpretation, but one which the scriptures themselves hint at. And if we do all of the cross-referencing, we see that this is quite a plausible interpretation. There are many other ways of reading the text that connect its contents to the Catholic tradition. For example, Pope Pius XII connects the song with the Assumption of Mary, and also some of the descriptions have been connected with the Eucharist. St. Ambrose of Milan has a lesson or a homily that interprets the song in those lines. But for lack of time, I'm not going to read those texts. Instead, I would like to encourage readers to look at Petrine Bergsma's chapter on the Song of Songs to see all the many and varied ways that this text has been interpreted in the Christian tradition. And I think that about plumbs all the depths of the book. I mean, no, it doesn't really. There are many other things that we can cover. But hopefully this will help readers to get a grasp of the song and all the different layers of meaning. And the nice thing about it is there's something for everyone, whether you're looking for something to enhance your understanding of marital love or God's love for you or your pursuit of wisdom. Song of Songs can be read in those terms.
Thank you so much for that, Louis. Really appreciate your expertise here and your time. Looking forward to the next one.
Yep, that's right. So I believe the next book is The Wisdom of Solomon.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I'm always happy when we reach one of the Deuterocanonical books because, as I mentioned before, having been Protestant for a long time, those books were neglected in a lot of my Bible studies. So the nice thing about covering these books in the commentaries is I'm making up for lost time, as it were.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And,
Mhm.
there's not a whole lot of people who are really offering commentaries online
Yeah.
from a Catholic perspective on the Bible, let alone the Deuterocanonicals. So this is severely needed.
Yep, for sure, for sure.
Well, thank you for that. Looking forward to the next one. We'll see y'all later. God bless.
God bless.